There's something almost magical about the way certain images lodge themselves in our collective imagination. You say, cowboy, and instantly, without any conscious effort, a figure materializes in the mind's eye. You know exactly what he looks like. He's a white man, probably somewhere in his 30s, weathered by sun and wind. He wears a wide-brimmed hat that's seen better days, a bandana loosely tied around his neck, leather chaps over dusty trousers. His boots have spurs that jingle faintly when he walks, that distinctive sound that says trouble or salvation is coming, depending on which side of the law you're standing. There's a Colt revolver on his hip, worn low for a quick draw, and somewhere nearby, a loyal horse waits patiently. This man is silent. He doesn't waste words. When he speaks, it matters. He lives by a code, his own code, not society's. And that code involves protecting the innocent, punishing the wicked, and never, ever shooting a man in the back. He rides alone across vast, empty landscapes, answering to no one, needing no one. He is freedom personified, the rugged individual who needs nothing but his wits, his gun, and the open sky. John Wayne gave us this man. So did Clint Eastwood, Gary Cooper, James Stewart. 1,000 Western films and television shows burned this image so deeply into our cultural consciousness that cowboy has become a word we use to describe a whole approach to life. Cowboy diplomacy, cowboy capitalism, going cowboy on a problem. We all understand what this means. Acting boldly, independently, perhaps recklessly, but always with a certain rough integrity. Here's the thing though, almost none of this is true. The real cowboys of the American West would barely recognize themselves in this portrait. If we could somehow resurrect one of them, transport him through time, and sit him down in front of a John Wayne marathon, he would probably laugh until he cried, and then maybe cry for real, at how completely his life and work had been misunderstood. Let's start with the most obvious misconception: what cowboys actually looked like. If you had visited a cattle ranch in Texas in 1875, or joined a cattle drive heading north to the railheads of Kansas, you would have encountered something that might have shocked you if you'd grown up on Western movies. Roughly 1 out of every 4 cowboys you met, perhaps even 1 out of 3, would have been black. This isn't modern revisionism. This isn't an attempt to retroactively diversify history to match contemporary sensibilities. This is simply what the historical record shows us, in census data, in ranch payroll books, in the memoirs and letters of the period, and most powerfully, in photographs. We have pictures of these men. They stare back at us across a century and a half, their faces weathered, their clothes dusty, their eyes holding stories we can only imagine. Black cowboys were not an exception or an anomaly. They were a fundamental part of the Western frontier. The reasons for this are rooted in one of the darkest chapters of American history. When the Civil War ended in 1865, approximately 4 million enslaved people suddenly found themselves free. Free, but with nothing. No land, no money, no education, no prospects. In the South, the old plantation owners were doing everything they could to recreate slavery in all but name, through black codes and sharecropping arrangements designed to keep the formerly enslaved in a state of perpetual debt and dependence. Violence was endemic. The Ku Klux Klan was riding. Many black Americans looked west and saw something that, if not exactly opportunity, was at least possibility. The frontier was short on people and long on work. Out there, a man might be judged, at least sometimes, at least partially, by what he could do rather than by the color of his skin. This wasn't equality, not by a long shot. Racism existed in the West, just as it existed everywhere in 19th century America. But there was work that needed doing, and not enough hands to do it. Cattle ranching was exactly this kind of work. The skills it required, riding, roping, handling livestock, surviving in harsh conditions, were skills that many formerly enslaved people already possessed. On the plantations, someone had to tend the animals, round up strays, break horses. That someone was often a slave. When these men gained their freedom, they carried those skills with them, and they found that Western ranchers were willing to pay for those skills, regardless of who possessed them. The names have mostly been forgotten, which is itself a kind of tragedy. Nat Love, who called himself Deadwood Dick, left behind an autobiography that offers a rare window into this vanished world. He describes cattle drives that lasted months, nights spent sleeping under the stars, encounters with hostile Native Americans, the camaraderie of men who worked and suffered together. Bill Pickett invented a technique called bulldogging, leaping from a galloping horse onto a running steer, grabbing its horns and wrestling it to the ground. This technique is still used in rodeos today, though few people know that a black cowboy created it. But black cowboys were not the only ones Hollywood erased. An equally large portion of the cowboy workforce was Mexican, or rather Mexican-American, though that term is somewhat misleading since the border moved several times during the 19th century, and many of these men had been living in the same place for generations before the United States decided that place was now American territory. Here's an irony that would be funny if it weren't so sad. The entire cowboy trade was Mexican. Americans didn't invent cattle ranching on the frontier. They copied it. Spanish colonists had been raising cattle in what is now Texas and California for well over a century before Anglo-American settlers showed up. These Spanish and later Mexican ranchers, the hacendados and their workers, the vaqueros, developed the entire system. The techniques for managing large herds on open range, the equipment for doing so, the clothing adapted to the work and the climate. When Americans moved into these territories, they didn't bring cowboy culture with them. They found it already there, fully developed, and adopted it. Listen to the language, and you can hear this history. Lasso comes from the Spanish lazo, meaning a loop or snare. Rodeo comes from rodear, meaning to round up or surround. Ranch is simply the Spanish word rancho. Mustang derives from mesteño, meaning a stray or ownerless animal. The word buckaroo, used especially in California and the Great Basin to describe a cowboy, is a corruption of vaquero, literally a worker of cows. Even bronco, describing a wild or unbroken horse, is Spanish, the wide-brimmed hat that we think of as quintessentially cowboy. It evolved from the Mexican sombrero, designed to protect against the brutal southwestern sun. The leather leg coverings called chaps. They're chaparreras, designed to protect riders pushing through the thick, thorny brush, the chaparral, that gave them their name. The high-heeled boots, the bandana, the techniques of roping and branding, all of this came from the vaquero tradition. American cowboys were not inventors. They were students, learning from teachers whose contributions they would later forget or choose not to remember. Now let's talk about what the actual work was like, because this is where the romantic image really starts to crumble. A working cowboy in the 1870s or 1880s earned approximately $1 a day. To put that in perspective, it was roughly the same wage as an unskilled factory worker in an eastern city. But the factory worker went home at night to a bed, to a roof over his head, to hot food prepared in a kitchen. The cowboy spent months at a time sleeping on the ground, often with nothing between him and the sky except his blanket and his hat. When it rained, he got wet. When it was cold, he shivered. When it was hot, he baked. The day began before dawn, not at dawn, but before it, in that grey half-light when the world is still indistinct. The first task was to catch your horse from the remuda, the herd of horses that travelled with the drive. This sounds simple. It wasn't. These weren't gentle, domesticated riding horses. They were half-wild animals, and many of them seemed to take personal offence at the idea of being saddled. Every morning was a small rodeo, a battle of wills between man and beast. Then came breakfast, prepared by the cook, the cookie, over an open fire. The menu was not varied. Coffee, strong enough to dissolve a spoon. Hardtack or biscuits. Beans, if you were lucky. Salt pork, maybe. That was it. That was every breakfast, every day, for months. The cook was one of the most important people on the drive, and smart cowboys never complained about the food, no matter how bad it was. An offended cook could make your life miserable in 100 small ways. After breakfast, the real work began. A cattle drive moved slowly. 10 to 15 miles a day was typical because you couldn't push cattle faster without wearing them down and reducing their value. Cowboys rode along the edges of the herd, a constantly moving perimeter patrol. Strays had to be chased back. Sick or injured animals had to be identified and dealt with. The herd had to be kept moving in the right direction, which was harder than it sounds when you're dealing with thousands of animals, each with its own ideas about where it wants to go. The dust was extraordinary. Thousands of hooves churning dry prairie soil created a cloud that hung over the herd like a brown fog. The bandana that cowboys wore around their necks wasn't decoration. It was pulled up over the nose and mouth to filter out the worst of the dust. Even so, after a few hours, your eyes were red, your throat was raw, and you were spitting mud. Lunch was eaten in the saddle because the herd kept moving. Dinner was beans again, coffee again, maybe some salt pork or bacon. Then, when you might have expected rest, came the night shifts. Someone had to watch the herd around the clock, because the most terrifying thing that could happen on a cattle drive was a stampede. Stampedes killed cowboys regularly. The trigger could be almost anything. A clap of thunder, a lightning flash, a wolf howling, a horse snorting at the wrong moment. Sometimes just a random spooked animal whose panic spread instantly to the others. One moment, you had a peacefully sleeping herd. The next moment, thousands of cattle were on their feet and running in blind terror through the darkness, trampling everything in their path. A horse could stumble in a prairie dog hole. A rider could be thrown. And then the herd would pass over him, and there would be nothing left to bury. Cowboys sang to their herds at night. This wasn't romantic sentiment. It was survival technique. The sound of a human voice, continuous and calm, seemed to soothe the cattle, to keep them from startling at the small noises of the night. The songs were often improvised, rambling, repetitive. The point was the sound, not the lyrics. A drive from Texas to Kansas took 2 to 3 months, covering nearly 1,000 miles along trails that acquired romantic names: the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Western Trail. At the end, when the cattle were delivered to the railheads for shipment east, the cowboy finally collected his pay. For an entire summer's brutal work, the dust, the danger, the loneliness, the bad food, the worse sleep, he might receive $100. What happened next has also been mythologized. We imagine the cowboy painting the town red, drinking and gambling and fighting with wild abandon. Sometimes this happened. A man who had spent 3 months sleeping on dirt and eating beans might feel entitled to some pleasures. But many cowboys were more careful with their money, knowing that it had to last until the next season's work. And some, more than the myths acknowledge, sent money home to families, or saved for the day when they might buy a small piece of land of their own. The average cowboy was about 24 years old. This was young men's work. Work for those without families to support, without property to maintain, without better options. Old cowboys were rare. The work used men up. Some died on the trails, from stampedes or river crossings or simple accidents. Some were crippled by falls from horses. Some got out, saved their money, found other work, built other lives. The romantic image of the independent loner, beholden to no one, was in reality a figure trapped by circumstances. A man who was a cowboy because he couldn't be anything else. And now, finally, let's talk about the guns. This is where the myth becomes most completely divorced from reality. The image we have, the cowboy with his trusty Colt revolver, ready for a quick draw at any moment, is largely fiction. On an actual cattle drive, most cowboys didn't carry pistols most of the time. A gun was extra weight, and weight mattered when you spent 12 or 14 hours a day in the saddle. Besides, what would you use it for? Against wolves, dogs were more effective. Against hostile Native Americans, your protection was numbers, not personal firepower. And ammunition cost money. We're so used to cheap modern cartridges that we forget what a significant expense ammunition was for a man earning $1 a day. You didn't waste bullets on target practice. You didn't fire warning shots. If you were carrying a gun at all, every round it contained represented a meaningful fraction of your wages. The revolvers of that era were also far less reliable and accurate than movies would have us believe. These were black powder weapons, susceptible to misfires from damp, from dust, from any number of mechanical failures. At distances beyond 30 or 40 feet, hitting a man-sized target was as much luck as skill. The cinematic quick-draw duel at 20 paces, with both combatants blazing away, would have been a comedy of errors, missed shots, misfires, fumbled reloads. And killing someone, even in the Wild West, had consequences. There were laws out there. There were sheriffs. There were judges. There were courts. Perhaps not as efficient or impartial as in the established cities of the East, but they existed. A man who killed another man, even in what he claimed was self-defense, faced investigation, possible trial, possible hanging. At minimum, he faced the prospect of having to flee, to change his name, to start over somewhere else. For a working cowboy, this was catastrophe. So they settled their differences other ways. Fistfights were common. Angry words were exchanged. But the constant gunplay of the movies, mostly fantasy.
Just saying them conjures images of lawlessness, of violence simmering always beneath the surface, of life held cheap and death dealt casually. Just saying them conjures images of lawlessness, of violence simmering always beneath the surface, of life held cheap and death dealt casually. These were the places where civilization ended and anarchy began, where a man's survival depended on his speed with a gun and his willingness to use it. At least, that's what we've been told. Let's look at some actual numbers, because numbers have a way of cutting through mythology. Dodge City, Kansas, was perhaps the most notorious of all the cattle towns, the wickedest little city in America, according to its own gleeful promotional materials. This was where the Cowboys came at the end of the long drive from Texas, flush with wages and hungry for entertainment. This was where Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson served as lawmen, where legends were supposedly made. Over a 10-year period during its wildest era, from 1876 to 1885, Dodge City recorded a total of 15 homicides, 15 deaths in 10 years, roughly 1.5 per year. Now, 1.5 murders per year in a town of perhaps 2,000 people isn't nothing. Violence existed, but consider the context. Consider what we've been led to believe about these places. Consider the dozens of bodies that pile up in any given Western film. Then consider 15 in 10 years. For comparison, modern Baltimore. A city of approximately 600,000 people typically records 300 to 400 homicides per year. If you do the math, adjusting for population, Dodge City was probably safer than many American cities today. Not perfectly safe, certainly, but not the non-stop bloodbath of popular imagination either. Here's something even more surprising. The Wild West had gun control, serious gun control, of the kind that would make modern Second Amendment activists apoplectic. Dodge City had an ordinance, a law, passed by the town government, enforced by the town marshal that prohibited carrying firearms within city limits. This wasn't a suggestion or a guideline. This was the law. At the main entrance to town stood a sign that could not have been clearer: the carrying of firearms strictly prohibited. When a cowboy rode into Dodge City after months on the trail, one of the first things he had to do was hand over his gun. He could leave it at his hotel, or check it with the sheriff, or deposit it at a special gun room that many saloons maintained for exactly this purpose. He would get it back when he left town. But while he was in town, he went unarmed. This wasn't unique to Dodge City. Tombstone, Arizona, site of the single most famous gunfight in Western history, had exactly the same law. So did many other frontier towns. The reason was simple. Town leaders had figured out that alcohol plus guns plus young men far from home equaled trouble. Remove one element of that equation, and you reduce the problem significantly. The irony is almost too perfect. The Wild West, that symbol of unfettered freedom, that argument for the right to bear arms, that libertarian fantasy of a world without government interference, actually regulated guns more strictly than many American cities do today. And this brings us to the gunfight at the OK Corral, which deserves examination precisely because it's so famous. What actually happened there tells us more about the real West than any number of movie shootouts. The date was October 26, 1881. The time was approximately 3 in the afternoon. The place was Tombstone, Arizona Territory, a silver mining boomtown that had sprung up almost overnight and attracted all the usual frontier characters: miners, merchants, gamblers, prostitutes, lawmen, and outlaws. On one side were the Earps. Virgil Earp was the town marshal, the chief law enforcement officer. With him were his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, both of whom served as his deputies at various times, and their friend John Henry Doc Holliday, a dentist turned gambler who had a reputation for violence and a friendship with Wyatt that dated back several years. On the other side were a group of men generally referred to as the Cowboys, not working cowboys in the sense we've been discussing, but rather a loose gang associated with cattle rustling and other criminal activities. That day, the group included Ike and Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne. The immediate cause of the confrontation was Tombstone's gun ordinance. The Cowboys were in town and they were armed. This was illegal. Virgil Earp, as town marshal, had the duty to disarm them. He gathered his brothers and Holiday and they walked to where the Cowboys were standing, in a narrow vacant lot near the OK Corral. What happened in the next 30 seconds has been debated for nearly a century and a half. Who drew first? Who fired first? Was this a legitimate law enforcement action or a settling of personal scores under color of authority? The Earps had enemies who claimed the latter. A preliminary hearing was held. Witnesses contradicted each other. The Earps were not indicted, but here's what we know for certain about the gunfight itself. It lasted approximately 30 seconds. In that half-minute, approximately 30 shots were fired. 3 men died, Billy Clanton, and both McClory brothers. 3 others were wounded, Virgil and Morgan Earp and Doc Holliday. Perhaps most striking is how close the combatants were to each other. They weren't facing off at opposite ends of a dusty street. They were crowded together in a space about 15 feet wide. At that range, they could almost have reached out and touched each other. It wasn't a duel. It was a chaotic close-quarters explosion of violence. Men firing point blank in dust and smoke, probably terrified, probably half-blind from the muzzle flashes, probably unable to tell who was shooting at whom. This was the most famous gunfight in Wild West history, and it looked nothing like the movies. The aftermath was ugly. Ike Clanton, who had survived the fight by running away, pursued a legal vendetta against the Earps. A few months later, Virgil Earp was ambushed and shot, permanently losing the use of his left arm. A few months after that, Morgan Earp was murdered while playing billiards, shot through a window. Wyatt Earp responded by riding out with a posse and killing several men he believed responsible extrajudicial executions that forced him to flee Arizona territory. He spent the rest of his long life as a professional gambler, a boxing referee, a minor celebrity trading on his reputation. None of this matched the myth. There was no clean triumph of good over evil. There were just violent men in a violent place, settling scores in blood, and what about the classic Western duel? 2 men facing each other on an empty street, hands hovering over holsters, waiting for someone to make the first move. Historians have searched diligently for documented examples of such confrontations. The results are disappointing for fans of Western movies. There may have been a handful of incidents that roughly fit this pattern over the entire history of the Wild West. A handful. The classic quick-draw duel, that staple of thousands of films, was essentially a myth. Real violence in the frontier towns looked different. It was a shot in the back at a saloon after an argument over cards. It was an ambush on a lonely road. It was a drunken fight that escalated beyond anyone's intention. It was domestic violence, largely ignored by law enforcement. None of this made for good cinema, but it was the reality. So where did the myth come from? Partly from dime novels, cheap, sensational paperbacks that began appearing while the frontier was still open, manufacturing legends about men who were still alive. Buffalo Bill was the subject of hundreds of these novels while still in his 30s. The authors, most of whom had never been west of the Mississippi, simply invented stories that would sell. Accuracy was not a concern. And then came Hollywood. The first Western film, The Great Train Robbery, premiered in 1903, less than a decade after the frontier was officially declared closed. It was 12 minutes long, featured a train robbery and a chase on horseback, and ended with a famous shot of a bandit firing directly at the camera. Audiences reportedly screamed and fled the theater. That was the beginning of a flood that has never really stopped. Westerns dominated American cinema for half a century, from the silent era through the 1960s. They shaped how Americans saw their own history, how they understood the settlement of the continent, how they conceived of masculinity and justice and the relationship between the individual and society. And they were, in large part, fantasy. Wyatt Earp himself lived until 1929, long enough to see the first Hollywood Westerns. He reportedly attempted to consult on films about the Old West and complained that they got everything wrong. No one listened. The myths were more profitable than the truth.
We come now to the most misunderstood figures in the story of the American West, the people who were there first. We call them Indians, a word that exists only because Christopher Columbus died believing he had reached India. We call them Native Americans, which is more accurate but still lumps together hundreds of distinct peoples who had little in common except the misfortune of being in the way of European expansion. Whatever we call them, we have almost certainly pictured them wrong. Close your eyes and imagine an Indian. The word still carries such power, despite everything. What do you see? A man on horseback, almost certainly. He wears a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers, a cascade of white and black that trails down his back. His face is painted in fierce designs. He carries a bow or a lance. He lives in a teepee, that elegant cone of poles and hide that we know from 1,000 images. He hunts buffalo across endless grasslands, following the herds in an eternal cycle of movement and plenty. This image is not invented from nothing. It corresponds, more or less, to the culture of certain tribes of the Great Plains, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Arapaho, the Kiowa, the Blackfoot. For these peoples, in the specific period from roughly 1750 to 1880, the image is reasonably accurate. The problem is that this image has become the image, the only image, the default setting in our minds for all Native American peoples. It's as if an alien visiting Earth saw only the Inuit of the Arctic, decided all humans lived in igloos and hunted seals, and then returned home to write a comprehensive book about human civilization. The reality is one of almost incomprehensible diversity. Before European contact, the territory that would become the United States was home to hundreds of distinct peoples, speaking hundreds of mutually unintelligible languages, practicing hundreds of different ways of life. They were as different from each other as the Norwegians are from the Nigerians, as the Japanese are from the Brazilians. Treating them as a single category is a failure of imagination that distorts everything we think we know. Let me take you on a brief tour of what actually existed. On the northwest coast, the territory of what is now Washington State, Oregon, British Columbia, and southern Alaska, lived peoples whose way of life would have been utterly foreign to the Plains tribes. The Tlingit, the Haida, the Kwakiutl, the Chinook. These were not nomads following game. They were settled peoples who lived in permanent villages and built houses. What houses they were? The great cedar longhouses of the northwest coast could be 100 feet long, housing multiple related families under one roof. The facades were carved with intricate designs, faces of animals and spirits and ancestors, painted in bold colors, black and red and white. Outside stood the totem poles for which this region is famous, not objects of worship as they're often misunderstood, but rather heraldic monuments, recording clan histories and legendary events. These peoples were not hunters in any sense that a plains warrior would recognize. They were fishermen, and the salmon was their staff of life. Each year, the great salmon runs brought millions of fish up the rivers from the sea, and the Northwest Coast peoples had developed sophisticated technologies to harvest this bounty: weirs and traps and nets, smokehouse for preservation, trading networks that distributed the catch across vast distances. Their society was hierarchical in ways that would have seemed strange on the egalitarian plains. There were nobles and commoners, and there were slaves, captives taken in warfare, who might be owned, traded, or killed at their master's whim. The great chiefs demonstrated their wealth and status through the potlatch, a ceremony in which they gave away, or sometimes destroyed, enormous quantities of valuable goods. The more you could afford to give away, the greater your prestige. Travel south to the deserts of the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and you find peoples equally different from the plains ideal. The Pueblo peoples, Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and many others, take their collective name from the Spanish word for village, because that's what the Spanish saw when they arrived: villages. Permanent, settled, sophisticated villages. Not teepees, not portable dwellings designed for nomadic life. Instead, these peoples built in stone and adobe, sun-dried brick, creating multi-story apartment complexes that would not look entirely out of place in a modern city. Pueblo Bonito, in Chaco Canyon, was built between roughly 850 and 1150 CE. It contained over 600 rooms and rose 5 stories high. It remained the largest building in North America until the late 19th century, when New York began constructing skyscrapers. The Pueblo peoples were farmers. For thousands of years before the horse came to the Americas, they had cultivated the 3 sisters: corn, beans, and squash, using sophisticated irrigation systems to make agriculture possible in an arid climate. They were engineers and architects, astronomers who aligned their buildings with celestial events, artists who created pottery that is prized to this day. They had no use for horses, because their way of life didn't require them. Travel east to the forests along the Atlantic seaboard, and you find still another world. Here lived the Iroquois, or as they called themselves, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. They were agricultural, growing corn and beans and squash like the Pueblos, but their political organization was unlike anything else on the continent. The Iroquois Confederacy united 5 nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, under a common constitution called the Great Law of Peace. Later, a 6th nation, the Tuscarora, joined. This was not a loose alliance, but a structured federation, with a council of 50 sachems, chiefs, who made decisions affecting all member nations. The sachems were nominated by clan mothers. Iroquois society traced descent through the female line. And those same clan mothers could remove sachems who failed in their duties. Some historians believe the Iroquois Confederacy influenced the Founding Fathers as they designed the United States Constitution. The extent of this influence is debated, but the connection is real. Benjamin Franklin knew the Iroquois, negotiated with them, and explicitly cited their confederacy as proof that diverse peoples could unite under a common government. Whether the Constitution's federal structure owes a direct debt to the Great Law of Peace, or merely a general inspiration, the Iroquois were demonstrably practicing federal democracy, while Europe was still mired in absolute monarchy. And now let me tell you something that may surprise you about those Plains tribes, the ones in the feathered headdresses, the ones we think of as the real Indians. Their entire way of life, the culture we consider timeless and eternal, existed for approximately 200 years. It was a historical blip, an adaptation to circumstances that arose from European contact. Here is the key fact. Before the Spanish arrived, there were no horses in the Americas. The ancestor of the modern horse had evolved in North America millions of years ago, but it went extinct approximately 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. When Columbus landed, the horse was as foreign to the Americas as the European who rode it. The Spanish brought horses to Mexico in the early 16th century. Over the following 200 years, some of those horses escaped, went feral, and multiplied on the Great Plains, which turned out to be ideal horse country, vast grasslands with few natural predators. By the early 1700s, wild mustangs numbered in the millions, and native peoples began to capture and tame them. This changed everything. Before the horse, the Sioux, to take one example, lived in the forests of what is now Minnesota. They practiced agriculture, growing corn and wild rice. They hunted, but on foot, which made hunting buffalo difficult and dangerous. Buffalo are faster than humans, and they're massive. Hunting them without horses required elaborate cooperative efforts, driving herds over cliffs, constructing elaborate surrounds, burning prairies to channel animal movement. The horse transformed the equation entirely. A mounted hunter could chase down a buffalo, ride alongside it, kill it with lance or bow. A mounted people could follow the great herds across the grasslands, harvesting animals at will. The horse made possible a way of life that had never existed before. The nomadic buffalo hunting culture that we now think of as quintessentially Native American. The teepee itself was a product of this transformation. The classic teepee, that tall, elegant cone of poles and buffalo hide, required long poles and heavy coverings that could only practically be transported by horse. Before horses, the ancestors of the Plains tribes used much smaller shelters, or did without permanent shelter altogether because everything had to be carried on human backs or dragged on small dog-pulled travois. Even the great feathered headdresses have a history. They were not ancient. They emerged in the horse culture period as symbols of status and achievement within a newly complex social system organized around mounted warfare and buffalo hunting. Each feather represented a specific deed, a brave act in battle, a successful horse raid, some other accomplishment that brought honor. A young man without achievements had no feathers to wear. So, when we picture the iconic Plains Indian, we are picturing a relatively recent phenomenon, a cultural adaptation to new technology, new resources, new possibilities. This doesn't make it less authentic or less Native American, but it should make us think about how quickly cultures can change and how misleading our notions of traditional and ancient can be. Now let me tell you about the wars. The popular image, gleaned from countless Western movies, is of constant conflict. Whooping warriors attacking wagon trains, desperate settlers defending their homesteads, cavalry riding to the rescue. The underlying assumption is that native peoples and white settlers were in perpetual, inevitable conflict from the moment of first contact. The reality was far more complicated. For most of American history, most of the time, relations between native peoples and Euro-Americans were peaceful. Trade was constant and mutually beneficial. Treaties were negotiated, and while these treaties were almost always unfair and were frequently violated by the American side, they represented real diplomatic engagement. Intermarriage occurred. Alliances formed, shifted, reformed. Native peoples were not simply obstacles to be cleared, but rather political actors with their own interests, strategies, and agency. The Cheyenne and Arapaho maintained peaceful relations with American settlers for decades. The Navajo traded with Spanish and Mexican settlers for centuries before conflict erupted. The Cherokee adapted so successfully to Euro-American culture, developing their own written language, publishing a newspaper, adopting a constitutional government, that they were called one of the 5 civilized tribes. This accommodation did not save them from forced removal on the Trail of Tears, but that is another story, and a damning one. The wars of extermination, and extermination is not too strong a word, came late, in the second half of the 19th century. They came when gold was discovered in California and Colorado and the Black Hills, when the transcontinental railroad needed building, when millions of settlers poured westward seeking land. Suddenly, the vast territories that had been left to native peoples because they seemed worthless were revealed to have value. And at that point, treaties were worth nothing. The destruction of the buffalo herds was deliberate policy, or at least deliberate practice that authorities did nothing to stop. In 1870, the Great Plains held somewhere between 30 and 60 million buffalo. Estimates vary widely, but the number was immense. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained. Professional hunters killed them for their hides, for their tongues, considered a delicacy, sometimes purely for sport, shooting from train windows and leaving the carcasses to rot. Army officers understood exactly what this meant and approved. "Kill the buffalo and you kill the Indian," one general reportedly said. Without the buffalo, the nomadic culture of the plains could not survive. Tribes that had lived freely for generations were faced with a stark choice: starvation or the reservation. Most chose the reservation, though some, the Lakota, the Nez Perce, the Comanche, fought desperate rearguard actions that produced the battles we remember. Little Bighorn, Chief Joseph's Retreat, the Red River War. By 1890, it was over. The survivors were confined to reservations, often on the poorest land available, dependent on government rations that might or might not arrive. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools whose explicit purpose was cultural destruction. "Kill the Indian, save the man" was the official motto. Hill, native languages were forbidden. Native religion was suppressed. Native identity was to be erased and replaced with something more convenient for the conquerors. The final irony is this: the Wild West myth was created precisely as the real West was being destroyed. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show began touring in 1883, offering audiences across America and Europe a spectacle of stagecoach attacks, cavalry charges, and Indian warfare, all the things that were rapidly ceasing to exist in reality. The show featured real Native Americans, including, for a time, Sitting Bull himself, the Hunk Papa Lakota chief who had helped defeat Custer at Little Bighorn. Sitting Bull and other native performers were paid to act out scenes of savage violence, attacking stagecoaches, letting out war whoops, dying dramatically under the guns of white cowboys and soldiers. Every night they performed their own defeat, and audiences cheered. This was how history became myth, and myth became more real than history. The dime novels and the Wild West shows, and eventually the movies, created a West that never existed. Simpler, more violent, more romantic than the complicated reality. That imaginary West lodged itself in the American consciousness and became part of how America understands itself. The real West was messier. It was black cowboys and Mexican vaqueros, Chinese railroad workers and Jewish merchants, prostitutes and preachers and con men. It was violence, yes, but also long stretches of tedium. It was racism and exploitation, but also unexpected alliances and genuine human connection across cultural lines. It was the destruction of ancient peoples and the creation of new communities. It was all of this at once, contradictory and confusing, like all real history. Understanding that real history matters, not to tear down myths for the sake of tearing them down, but to see clearly who we are and where we came from. The mythic West tells us comforting stories about American virtue. The real West tells us more complicated stories about American humanity, the good and the bad, the brave and the shameful, the whole tangled mess of it. Those stories deserve to be told. They are, in their way, more interesting than the myths, because they are true. And there is something deeply valuable about knowing what actually happened, even when, especially when, it challenges what we thought we knew. The cowboys drove their herds north through dust and danger, and many of them were not white. The sheriffs tried to keep order in towns that were growing faster than the law could keep up, and they confiscated more guns than they ever fired. The Native Americans fought for their world and lost, and their cultures were not primitive or static, but as sophisticated and adaptive as any on Earth. This is the real Wild West. It deserves to be remembered.